All right, welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're going to put on our detective hats. We're going to crack the code on how efficient a company really is, using some clues hidden right inside their financial reports.
You know, it's easy to look at profit and think everything's great. But how can you really tell if a company is running a tight ship? I mean, it could be profitable, sure, but what if it's sluggish, inefficient? What if it's bleeding cash in ways that aren't obvious? Well, that's the exact mystery we're diving in today. We're going beyond the big headlines and getting right to the core of the business.
And to solve any case, what does a detective need? A toolkit, right? Well, for us, that toolkit is something called operating ratios. Think of these as our financial magnifying glass, our fingerprint kit. They're the tools that let us see how well a company is actually running things day to day. They really do tell the story behind the numbers.
So let's get a bit more official here. What exactly are these things? Simply put, they're financial metrics that show us how efficient a company is. It's like peeking under the hood of a car to see how well the engine is actually running. And this is the key part, they show us how much profit those operations are generating.
Okay, let's open up this detective toolkit and pull out our first set of clues.
So, here's the first big question we need to ask, and it's a great one. How many dollars in sales can a company squeeze out of every dollar's worth of stuff it owns? This stuff is its assets. And we measure this with a whole family of ratios called turnover ratios. They're all about measuring activity and ultimately efficiency.
And the first big clue we're going to look at is asset turnover. This one's pretty straightforward. It tells us just how hard a company's assets are working to bring in revenue.
And we can get even more specific. Let's start with fixed asset turnover. Now, fixed assets, these are the big ticket items, the factories, the heavy machinery, the buildings. This ratio helps us answer a really important question. Are these super expensive things just sitting there? Or are they humming along, actually making money for the business? And the math behind it is actually pretty simple. You just take the company's net sales and divide that by the average value of its fixed assets. What you get is a single but very powerful number.
So, what does that number actually tell you? Let's say the ratio is 5. That means the company is generating 5 rupees in sales for every single rupee it has tied up in fixed assets. That's pretty powerful, right? Now, you'd think higher is always better, and generally it is. But, and this is a big but, you have to compare it within the same industry. A business that's all factories is going to have a way different ratio than, say, a software company. And we can apply this same turnover logic to get an even clearer picture. For example, you can look at the total asset turnover ratio. That broadens the lens to see how well a company uses all its assets, not just the big fixed ones. And then there's the working capital turnover ratio, which gets really specific. It tells you how efficiently the company is using its day-to-day cash, the money it needs to operate to drive sales. When you look at all these together, you start to get a really complete picture of efficiency.
Okay, so making a sale is great, but you know what's even better? Actually getting the cash in the bank for that sale. And that brings us to our next crucial clue. How well does the company collect its cash?
This is where we look at something called the accounts receivable turnover ratio. Now, accounts receivable is just the fancy business term for the money that customers owe the company. So, this ratio tells us exactly how good they are at collecting on those IOUs. And just like before, the general rule is higher is better. But why? Why is that so important? What does getting paid quickly really say about a company's health?
Well, it all comes down to cash flow. A high ratio tells you the company is getting its money fast. It means their collection process is efficient and that cash isn't just sitting around in their customers' bank accounts. On the flip side, a low ratio can be a major red flag. It might mean customers aren't paying on time, which can starve the company of the cash it needs to, operate.
Okay, so let's recap. We know how well the company uses its stuff to make sales, and we know how fast it gets paid. But there's one last, huge piece of the puzzle, right? After all that work, how much profit is actually left over?
And to answer that, we turn to our profitability clues. And there are 2 big ones here: gross margin and operating margin. Each one gives us a look at the company's profit, but at 2 slightly different stages.
So what's the difference? Well, gross margin measures the profit right after you subtract the direct cost of making the product. So think of it as the profit on the item itself.
But then, operating margin takes it a step further. It shows the profit from the entire core business before you start dealing with things like interest and taxes. It's a really pure measure of how much money the main operation is making.
So, we've got our clues. We've looked at asset turnover, we've looked at cash collection, and we've looked at profitability. Now it's time to put all the pieces together and crack the code.
But wait, before we declare this case solved, every good detective needs to know the rules of the game. And here they are. First and foremost, a single ratio on its own tells you almost nothing. It's useless. The real power, the real insight comes from comparison. You have to compare these numbers to the company's own history. Is it getting better or worse? And even more importantly, you have to compare it to its competitors. That's when the story really starts to emerge.
So there you have it. You now have the Financial Detective's Toolkit. You know the clues to look for, so the next time you look at a company's financials, you're not just going to see a bunch of numbers. You're going to see a story waiting to be told. The only question left is, what story will you uncover? Thanks for joining me on The Explainer.